Hello, this is Stephen Kelly from KNO again. This podcast we're going to focus on something that I consider very important. Everyone talks about ROI, or return on investment, but often that can only be calculated at the end of a project. And so what's very important before you start any kind of project, be that maybe a training project or other type of performance improvement project, is to be able to predict what the potential is to improve the performance at the end. And so one way to do this is calculating what we call PiPs, or PiPs, which is potential to improve performance. And so I'll take a few minutes now today to go over some examples with you how we can calculate that, so you can consider how you might use that in your own workplace to determine whether or not a specific project is worth doing, and at the same time, how much investment can you put into it to make sure that it really works. So then in a moment then we'll start with our example. Okay, so let's start with our first example now. Remember, what we're trying to do is take a look at, before we do some kind of intervention, to try to determine, in fact, what kind of potential impact we might have. So for this first case, we're calculating a potential to improve performance for a sales situation. So in this case, let's say we have a company, has a particular product line that they're selling, basically revenues of about 100 million for this particular product, okay? And then to make things relatively simple for our calculations, let's say we have 20 salespeople who are in fact selling this product. So if we look at this, you could say, well, 20 people, 100 million, probably each one's doing what? About what? 5 million. But in fact, we know in the real world that not all salespeople are equal. So in this case, what we find as we look at the data, it's always useful to try to find who are actually the best performers, and that's how we normally calculate this potential to improve performance. We look at the best, we look at everyone else, and see how we might be able to improve the everyone else closer to the performance of the top people. Often I like to use 10%. If you have a very, very big group, you might go to 5% of the performers to look at the top people. In this case, we say 10%. In this case, that's 2 people of 20. And when we look at the data, we find that on average, these people are doing about 14 million sales each during these time periods. 14 million, fairly high. And then when we look at the other people, we find out that the remaining 90% on average is turning out about 4 million sales. These are averages, so some people are higher, some people are lower. Now we look at this and we're assuming that generally the conditions these people are operating in are similar. Okay, not that somebody's got a fantastic territory that's allowing them to get all this extra sales. We're considering that we pick people who are generally with common conditions. The only difference seems to be their own ability as salespeople, what they're doing. So we have 100 million, 20, and then the average of the top 10% is 14 million, and the remaining 90% average about 4 million. So now let's stop for a second, take a look at those figures, in case you can't read these. Okay, so now we're back. Now let's say if we want to first calculate our ratio, our PIP ratio, first this is very simple. We can say the worth of our top 10% then is about 14 to the worth of the average 90% is 4. We make a ratio out of that, and what do we come up with? Basically looking at 3.5 times potential for improvement. So what we're saying is if we could come up with the right way to solve this problem, and that might be changes to procedure, maybe training, and maybe a combination of things, motivation strategies, compensation, that we might have the potential to move our average performers up 3.5 times to get closer to the top performers. Now we take a look at these numbers, and then we'll go back into how we calculate our scenario. Okay, so now we're back. Now let's work through the calculation for this particular scenario. What we have now, we have our original figures. So what we want to do is we want to decide how much improvement and what would be the value of that improvement if we were able to affect change before we decide whether or not it's worthwhile to do something. So first, we don't assume we can move all 18 people up to the full capability of the best 2. So we want to be conservative in our estimates. So first thing we do is we just say, what if we can only improve 50% of our salespeople? Okay, just 50%. So of those 18, maybe we can get 9 of them to move up their performance. At the same time then, let's assume we can only improve them to a 50% gain according to your top 10%. So not even full gain, just 50%. So in this case we had a 3.5 pip, so we make that a 1.75 potential for improvement. Okay, so we're being very conservative. Half the people, half the performance, okay? Acceptable. Now what we want to do then is figure out what could be the individual improvement that we would get out of this. In this case, we knew that the average 90% were making about 4 million sales in each period. So then if we multiply that 1.75, then we get a what? 7 million new level of sales. Good increase. Of course, we realized that they're already making 4 million on average, so the actual change then is just 3 million. But still, a nice change. Now finally what we come to here is we got 3 million change times 9 people. What is that? Net gain of 27 million. Or, in a percentage term, since we had 100 million sales, a nice 27% gain through this intervention. We don't know the intervention yet. Partly what we're trying to decide is what is the value if we go into the intervention. Now what kind of interventions might we do here? Usually some kind of a combination. You're taking a look at probably investigating what are your best top 10% doing, trying to get that down. It could be the way they're planning. It might be some of the behaviors they use, how they go about working with their clients, presentation materials, sales materials. Who knows? That's partly needed to be investigated, how it actually works. Then when you discover the gap between them and your others, then you can begin coming up with strategies to address that gap. So what we have in this first series then is a very simple approach to how you can calculate your potential to improve performance in a fairly straightforward sales situation. As you know, it doesn't take too long to do this. You have the basic numbers. It takes 15 or 20 minutes. And it also then, it's helping then to make a good decision. How much do we want to put into solving this kind of a problem? If we want to go forth with some kind of an investigation, a needs assessment, and maybe a training program, a little bit change in motivation strategy, if that thing's going to cost us maybe 5 million, and we can get a gain potentially of 27, and remember this is 27 is a conservative gain, then that can be a five times return on investment. Pretty good. If this gain is going to cost us, in fact, 30 million to do, then maybe it's not worthwhile. So another thing we might remember is that this potential to improve performance is tied very much to the difference between your best 10% and your other 90%. When you have a ratio that's very, very close, then there's a question how much you really can do to solve that problem. In the case of an example would be Olympics. You have swimmers. All of them are very, very close. They're fighting to get a few extra seconds, or in a case of a running team. So the question is how much you invest to get that little bit more distance. Typically in a work environment though, we find that there are usually quite substantial differences between your top performers and then your other performers. So before we go on to our next sample then, our next example, the production example, we have the scenario calculation. We'll stop for a moment, put it up on the screen so you can stop and take a look at those numbers.